Judith Brown's Lamentations group, photographed by James Stanton Abbott. For these ghostly figures, Vermont sculptor Judith Brown drew inspiration from choreographer Martha Graham's modern dance Lamentations. Brown welded sculptural assemblages of scrap metal, oil cans, car parts, corrugated roofing materials. They were installed on the green in 1993 after Brown's death. Then they began to rust and fall apart from what conservators call inherent vice, until the black metal nearly looked like black lace. Jeffrey Sass, who had been Brown's studio assistant and had helped make the figures years earlier, took them back in to refashion them with new pieces. We became these figures this fall as we choreographed ourselves to proceed, but distantly, as carefully as we could. Our lamentations multiplied and will continue to multiply. We will assemble and reassemble our grief out of what scraps are at hand as we move onward. We will need care as we fall apart from people we trust to put us back together. Alice Boone, Curator of Education and Public Programs.
Farm Summer 1948 by Herbert Meyer. This elegantly rendered painting of a Vermont landscape captures the peace and beauty of a time gone by. Or does it? The year 1948 was unsettled in ways that might feel familiar today. America was still emerging from World War II. President Truman reinstated the draft amid Cold War tensions. Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated. A plane crash in Los Gatos, California inspired Woody Guthrie to write the protest song Deportee. 4 white Americans had died in the crash and drew extensive coverage. 28 migrant farm workers also perished and were referred to simply as deportees. Was Meyer oblivious to the world around him? I would like to think not. Rather, I believe that he was aware of his gift as an artist, and in a small way is sharing a fleeting image of hope and serenity through the medium of light and color. Jeff Falgraf, exhibition designer and preparator.
Half-Inch Grid by Ernst Benker. This painting reminds me of a maze, which is exactly how this time in history feels to me. We are navigating uncharted territory in so many ways. The pandemic, new ways of socializing online and distanced in person, white people understanding the concept of systemic racism, remote learning, remote working, medical fragility, to name a few. I don't see a clear exit point. I see a lot of ways to work around the barriers that may work for a period of time, but those improvised paths mostly lead to more barriers, which is a metaphor to me for how life feels right now. Stephanie Glock, business manager.
Lotto, the American Dream by Louise Cruz Azacita. What are the numbers in the background of Louise Cruz Azacita's print, Lotto, the American Dream? While the title points to the idea of lotto numbers, they make me think of zip codes, area codes, phone numbers, latitude and longitude, numbers that define the geographic boundaries of our lives. For many people in the U.S., those geographic boundaries are racial ones as well, as the legacies of racist housing policies, ongoing cycles of gentrification, and the preference of white people for white neighborhoods maintain residential segregation. The intertwining of geography and race then determine access to quality education, healthcare, jobs, food, and shelter, the essential elements of the American dream of safety and comfort. If geography is a lottery system, it's a rigged one. Andrea Rosen, curator.
Unemployment by Ronald Slayton. Vermont artist Ronald Slayton painted this at a time when Americans were feeling the full impact of the Great Depression. The country had reached an unemployment rate of almost 25% in 1933, with scenes of men waiting in line for unemployment checks, passing time on park benches, and ringing doorbells looking for work. This painting makes me acutely aware of the ongoing financial vulnerability caused by American capitalism, as well as Americans' enormous fortitude. In a little over a decade, we've experienced the Great Recession and now the economic impact of the coronavirus pandemic. The man at the center of the painting looks out at us, gaunt and hurting. The artist may have meant to elicit a sense of empathy or solidarity in the viewer, acknowledging the shared experience of fellow Vermonters. 85 years later, he appears like a time traveler, connecting with a knowing glance from one distressing historical moment to another. While unemployment in our time looks different from Slayton's depiction, it carries the same uncertainties and fears. Janie Cohen, director.
Margarita de Bonaparte by Manuel Alvarez Bravo. As someone of Native American descent, I have an immediate and undeniable response to this photograph. There's comforting familiarity. Her face evokes friends and family from Los Angeles. There's also a sense of sadness and yearning because I'm keenly aware of how few people here in the Northeast look like her. The subject, most likely from one of Mexico's indigenous groups, is daring you to look back at her. Often, pictures of Native people have a kind of tokenism to them, like curiously exotic displays that allow white viewers the comfort of objective analysis. Not this photo. She's staring the viewer down, demanding we reckon with prejudice and privilege. Cynthia Cagle, Guest Services Coordinator.
Silent Seasons, Autumn, by Will Barnett. This is one of a series of 4 prints by the artist depicting a young woman at her window during each of the 4 seasons. The gentle yellow sky, the rust color of the dress, the red and green tones of the parrot and the apple in this print all evoke a feeling of autumn. As a transitional period, autumn can be divisive. Some find the crisp air exhilarating, while others find the shorter days a dreary portent of the winter to come. Similarly, this print can be read in many ways. The subject rests her head in her hand and gazes out her window, and we are able to map our own internal state onto her neutral expression. After many months of social isolation, this print has taken on a new meaning for me, perhaps. The solitary nature of the subject, her gaze outward into a world from which she is closed off, and the flattened nature of the shapes and space all combine to create a sense of quiet, of isolation, of waiting. Emily Stone King, Collections Assistant.
The Fugitive Story by John Rogers. I first came across John Rogers' plaster sculptures haphazardly on display in a Vermont country store. I found the attention to period detail fascinating, from inkwells to clothing to teacups. In the 1860s and 70s, Rogers groups were marketed as commemorative objects for families to connect with American history in familiar, sentimental scenes. This one shows the abolitionists John Greenleaf Whittier, Henry Ward Beecher, and William Lloyd Garrison as they hear the story of an African-American woman and child. Yet as they claim to represent history, they are also idealized and not entirely accurate. The woman and child are not specific portraits. Rogers did not use a particular model and created a generic sculpture of an enslaved woman and child. Ironically, the sculpture is supposed to be about the fugitive story, but Rogers lavishes his detail on the 3 great men of history. Scenes like this ignore the stories of anonymous people of color in American history, whose individual identities are not considered worthy of being recorded by artists like Rogers. Recognizing and identifying people who are pushed to the edges or forgotten in our histories is important to me. It is why the preservation of material culture and art, and the close study of them, can help us rediscover and remember those lives. Margaret Tamulonis, Collections Manager.
The Storm by Howard Giles. The storm is at once ominous and hopeful. The massive storm is slowly clearing, and the sun is fighting to regain its position, illuminating the stalwart little village in the foreground and promising hope for the future, a relevant theme in these turbulent times. As someone who has struggled with depression for most of my life, I see both the lows and highs of my condition present in this painting. At a glance, the palette of dense grays and muted browns is somber, and should the storm be traveling right to left, the subject matter is arguably grim. It reminds me that the ever-present hold my illness has on my daily life depends a lot on the vantage point I use to view things. My mother passed away from a long illness, just weeks before the country plunged into quarantine. The combined effect was debilitating at first. That storm enveloped all that was important to me, and I sank to a place as bleak as the horizon in this painting. In time, I rallied and found comfort in my family, my work, and spending time in the wonderful natural retreats our beautiful state provides. Chris Dissinger, Assistant Director.